Let me now introduce, I want to just say, I don't know if everyone realizes this, but Neil Cohen was going to be here for the forum, and with the death of Daniel Shore, some of our folks weren't able to attend the Aspen Environment Forum, but I am so happy that we have David Brancaccio here. It's a voice I've had in my ear listening for years, and I'm really so pleased that he'll be able to moderate this session. This session is entitled Trusting Climate Science, What We Know and Need to Know. Thank you.
Buonasera? No, I don't think so. Buongiorno. Buongiorno. I want to just set the record straight on something that I think this particular group should know, just before we get to this great panel. How many people here, show of hands, have seen that recurring New Yorker magazine cartoon where you climb the high Himalayas and there's the wise man with the beard in the cave dispensing wisdom? Anybody seen that, right? It's wrong. We were doing a PBS show about a year ago about climate change, glaciers, water scarcity, national security, food security, and we actually climbed to the Gangotri Glacier, considered the source of the sacred Ganges River. And we climbed to the source. I was with a famous Everest guy, and he wanted to go further, so we climbed across the glacier and up the moraine onto this magical alpine meadow. And there, at the top of the earth, in a cave, was a wise woman. It's a woman, of course. Her name was Mata Bhakti Priyananda, she who loves devotion, she said. And she spoke American accented English. She was Indian. And I asked her about it. She said, oh, by the way, she has a master's degree in special ed from Northern Illinois State. Number one. Number two, and the reason I'm actually sharing this brief story with you, is that she says, what are you up to? And we said, we're trying to bring this issue of climate change home to our American audience. Well, why should they care? I said, well, and explained a bit about how the CO2 mixes in our atmosphere and we're all part of this. Not just Americans, but certainly not just the people in this part of India. We're complicit in all this. And she said something very significant to us, and we used a tiny piece of it in the final documentary. She says, look, if people watch your television account of this journey and kind of shrug and nod their heads and move on, you haven't done very much, have you? She said. However, if people are motivated to take action, then, she said, young man, your quest is worthy. So it was this great moment where if you wrote it, it would seem cliche, but because it was documentary film, it was wonderful. So thank you for all of you who have, just by your very presence, taken action in your lives on these crucial issues. Let me introduce this incredible panel. On my far right, on the left of the panel, Peter Huybers, climate scientist and professor at Harvard. When you want to know about glaciers, ocean temperatures, ocean circulation, among many other things, he is the man. Peter, thank you for coming. We have Andrew Revkin, .Earth, New York Times, but also at Pace University these days, Senior Fellow for Environmental Understanding at Pace University's Academy for Applied Environmental Sciences. I got it, there we go. And just here, Mohan Munasinghe, Vice Chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Mohan would be eligible for a parking space at UC Berkeley. He has a Nobel Peace Prize. And they don't give you a parking space at Berkeley until you have the Nobel, by the way. Yeah, so you could collect on that, I think. Author of 90 books and chair of the Munasinghe Institute of Development. Thank you very much for doing this for us. Let me start by going through one by one through the panel. We're actually going to start here and move in this direction on this overarching question about trusting climate science. It's been a period where the Copenhagen Climate Summit was marked by what's come to be known as Climate Gate, a scandal. And we've all followed the scandal, but moving forward from the scandal, I'd like to know... You want to go the other way around? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Is that all right with you, Peter, or is that going to panic you?
No problem.
We'll do it that way. What are some lessons that you have drawn from the ClimateGate scandal?
Okay. Well, speaking personally as a scientist, I think it highlights a certain dilemma that a scientist faces. On the one hand, science as an undertaking is predicated upon openness, honest questioning, reproducibility. On the other hand, when there's the kind of fear that uncertainties might be twisted erroneously into arguments against particular issues, I have the sense that there is a kind of a natural human response to say, I don't want to expose myself to that. But in many ways, that undermines the entire scientific process. And so, speaking not about the fact that hacking into people's emails is probably incorrect and that the public response is perhaps out of proportion, but just from the scientific community perspective, I think that there's a lesson to be drawn from this and from other types of scandals like this which have occurred in the past, that we really need to be as completely open, reproducible, and upfront about all uncertainties as we possibly can. In the long run, that's going to be what our credibility is founded upon. In the short run, it might be used against us in certain ways, but we really have to be careful not to fall into this trap of trying to defend ourselves against things and losing the bigger picture.
I'm thinking an emerging theme here is going to be this issue of embracing the uncertainties and how we cope with the uncertainties. Mr. Revkin, lessons drawn from this?
Well, again, I'm not a scientist. I'm a consumer of science findings, and for more than 20 years, 25 years, I've been writing about global warming, this thing, the human influence on climate. And what I have learned in that time is that science, as you well know, and is a push-me-pull-you process involving a lot of tension, a lot of big egos, and a lot of stakes in the case of global warming. So the stakes were driving the energy of those who felt passionate enough to, we don't know yet, it hasn't been determined, no one has said they broke a law, but someone liberated or hacked information that the people who created that information, these folders of 1,000 or 2 things, didn't expect to be public. You have this sense that we have to, the scientists, as you said, the scientific community has to get comfortable with the reality of what they do. That what we do, the learning is the process of, it's kind of like piranhas nibbling at something, and whatever is left is the robust skeleton of the idea. And any new idea, any new paper is constantly being challenged. So it didn't surprise me to see in those emails that one very respected scientist at a federal lab said he wanted to punch out another scientist at a meeting, a skeptic, the next time he saw him. I think to the average person out there, this came as, again, depending on your point of view on global warming, you either said, aha, they're all a cabal trying to foist a myth on us, or, oh my God, this is a horrible intrusion into privacy. So the process is normal. It's ugly. The foundation understanding of global warming is unchanged. But don't expect that to kind of go away anytime soon. Unfortunately, the stakes are still very high, so you're going to have another reality is transparency will be imposed upon you in the 21st century, whether you want it or not. So best to be transparent from the get-go, including the Ipcc has come into some of the same scrutiny.
Professor Munasinghe, your lessons drawn from this
Well,
chapter?
Let me start by saying it's a privilege to be in front of an erudite audience with a distinguished panel of colleagues. Very quickly, I'll give a broader answer because my colleagues have dealt more with the specifics. And see, the art of science for policy making is all about how you deal with risks and risk management. To be personal, yesterday I missed a flight because the plane was grounded because of storms in New York. And that was a risk management decision. And I mean, the climate science, if you take the whole of it, tells us, the Ipcc says that there's a 99% probability that we are in a situation of climate change. Now, which one of you would get on a plane, planet Earth, if there was a 99% chance of disaster? So that is it. But it's broader than that because in a sense, we are not only facing climate change, but also multiple problems. Can I have the slides, please? Yeah. And I'll quickly run through. Okay. See, we're facing not just climate, but also financial economic crisis, problems of poverty, environmental harm, and shortage of resources. Climate is just the ultimate threat multiplier that will make all the other problems worse. Now, the question is, how do we deal with these other risks? What are the issues? If you look at the question of financial markets and the bubble that was created, okay, there is also another issue of growth, because all this talk about poverty and so growth is hiding the unfortunate bubble of poverty of 2 billion people. And climate, which is the one we are talking about, is also a bubble because we are using the planet's resources without thinking about the consequences. Now, if you look at the responses, you'll see that we've spent $5 trillion in very short order without certainty to solve the financial problem, right? We are spending about 100 billion per year to address the problem of poverty, and only a few billion for climate change. So what is the yardstick we are using here? Why is it that climate change, we are asking for 100% certainty? And basically, military expenditure is 1.2 trillion. So let me stop at that and just tell you that we have to think in terms of risk management when we think about ClimateGate or any of this. What is the yardstick we are using, and how are we managing risks in other domains with much less evidence? That's my answer.
Do you think that policymakers and the public misunderstand risk management? That we're uncomfortable with these ideas of uncertainty and how to parse different levels of uncertainty?
I think policymakers, particularly the more intelligent ones, understand the problems very well, but they face the problem of the next election, as you know, in a democracy. And so there is the whole issue of enlightened media and scientists who are willing to be articulate and speak out. The whole question of disseminating information, educating people, and the other side of the coin, which was mentioned obliquely, about people who, for their own reasons, confuse the issue and cloud the issue. But basically, I think some politicians understand it, but they are waiting, in a sense, for the mass of the population to support them.
Which is one of the reasons that we've heard in some of these other sessions for the failure of the climate bill in the United States, is the public was not pushing their elected officials quite at the rate that would have been necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to hog the discussion, but let me give you another simple example. The $5 trillion that went into the stimulus packages, a much greater proportion of that could have gone into green investments, into green agriculture and all these other things. Korea is the champion. 80% of their stimulus package went into green investments. Most other countries, 10 or 15%. So we lost a great opportunity to change momentum. Why? Because the politicians were perhaps not as bold enough, and also the lobbies. I mean, sure, bailing out banks is important, but we didn't need to put all the money into that. Okay? I mean, that's my personal view as an economist.
Dr. Huybers, Peter, we were talking this morning on this theme of the uncertainties. There are a lot of uncertainties. There's not a lot of uncertainties about if human hand in climate change, but there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and you're working on some of it right now.
Right. I think it's the right way to phrase the issue, that anthropogenic change in the composition of the atmosphere in terms of our surfaces does expose us to greater risks in terms of changes in temperature, precipitation, sea level, and on. And we have a decent handle in terms of kind of a quasi-linear extrapolation from our present state into what the future is going to look like. And the further away we get from the present, trying to predict what the future is going to look like, the increasing amount of uncertainty you have associated with those extrapolations. But you also have this additional source of uncertainty that the present state is not indicative of how the climate has always operated. And there are possibilities for kind of original types of phenomena to emerge that we don't really have a good handle on. There's a joke where you have the drunkard who's looking for his keys underneath the lamppost, and when asked, why are you looking here, he says, well, it's the only place I can see anything. and so when you kind of peer into the darkness further on, you see that there's these kind of low probability but potentially high risk types of possibilities that I think in many ways are the ones that we should be truly concerned about. The changes that we're predicting kind of away from this current state in a linear, quasi-linear type of framework are going to pose difficulties. They're going to exacerbate current difficulties. But I don't think that they should be characterized as catastrophes over the scale of what would arise in the coming century. But if we look back in the geologic record about things that seem to have happened, sea level coming up at rates of multiple meters per century, we can say along that theme, is the West Antarctic ice sheet stable? And I don't think anyone can answer that question. We don't really know. What would it look like if it was going unstable? We're not really sure about that either. Eastern equatorial Pacific, currently during an El Nino, temperatures rise by maybe 1, most 2 degrees Celsius. During the Pliocene, a period 3 million years ago, the Eastern equatorial Pacific was about 3 degrees Celsius warmer, apparently an annual average. None of our climate models can predict that. We don't have the theory to understand why that occurs. Nonetheless, we have very good observations that did occur. Precipitation patterns seem to have changed dramatically during the last glacial maximum period and kind of period of time between 80,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago. We see that the North Atlantic's temperature increased by about 10 degrees Celsius in the span of a couple years, apparently because ice retreated very rapidly. If the Arctic sea ice retreats rapidly, what's going to happen? These types of kind of out-of-the-box possibilities, I think in many ways, are the major uncertainties that we really need to keep a close eye upon. And they're the things that I don't think anyone should say that there's even a good probability that any of what I said is going to happen. But they're things that we should keep in mind, and we should guard ourselves against those risks as much as possible.
I suppose the financial meltdown, though, was a case of a very low probability occurrence causing massive disruption. I mean, it is sensitizing the world to the fact that we have to keep an eye on these things.
Right.
I'm just an amateur when it comes to covering these matters, but Andy, you're a professional. I was a little shocked when I hung out with climate scientists various times about how little they do know about all these areas of inquiry where we need more data. Does it still shock you, or this is just you're coming to grips with this?
Well, there's so many threads here that are interesting, and I think the thing that links this discussion of risk management with the basics of the climate science is that we have to get comfortable with the reality. The reality of this problem is very different than the way it was presented in a most visible way several years ago, which was that case closed. We know now humans are catastrophically changing the climate, and it's starting to unfold, and there's certainty. And there was a glossing over of the complexities in a way that I think fueled some of those who are dead set, whether they're for professional reasons because they work for fossil fuel companies or just because they're passionate libertarians, don't agree with this idea of defossilizing, decarbonizing our economy. So you had this, the way I've been describing this, I don't think I've written this on the blog, but in talking about it is, there was a sloshing of public opinion toward concern over global warming several years ago, driven by the Ipcc, by an inconvenient truth, the Katrinaization of global warming, and then the complexities, the actual science has now come out again. There's been a lot of piranha nibbling the last year or so, some professional piranhas, and some of it's just being the reality of the science. So now we're back. There was this sloshing of public opinion toward, maybe this is all a hoax, the last few months. And now, basically, we're left again with this. The reality is, the things that are most consequential to society about global warming are still the least certain. The pace of sea level rise by 2100 is complicated, and there's no probable scenario. There are plausible scenarios. So, to me, it's a distraction. You'll see this continuing distraction. Advocates for some policy saying, oh, now we know sea level is going to be rising 4 feet by 2100, and someone else saying, no, we don't know that, and this is why. That's kind of like arguing about a bus that's parked on a hill in San Francisco about whether it's going 1, 2, or 3 miles an hour as it's starting to roll down the hill. The reality that's well established is that sea levels are going to rise for millennia, pretty much. Right, we're pretty much locked in, at least centuries, and if not more. The pace in our meaningful time scale is unfortunately not clear. So that's why it's such an ugly nut in the policy realm. Frankly, I think the projections that were out there for the financial collapse several years ago, those voices had a much clearer database to draw on than in this scenario. This is actually harder, I think, than getting comfortable with the complexities in the financial realm.
We can't know everything at once, but what do we need to know soon? Where should we concentrate our efforts in this realm of what we're uncertain about? What could we start solving?
I think you've heard a lot about what we need to know about climate science, and that work has to continue, and the Ipcc and others are working on it. But there's also the other side, the impacts, because ultimately it is human beings and their fate that concerns us, because the planet will continue whether there's climate change or not. And there the issue is very serious. I mean, just to give you an example, Kofi Annan produced a report a couple of years ago, last year, in which basically, not as authoritative as the Ipcc, but the numbers are startling. They said already climate change is causing something of the order of 300,000 deaths per year, I mean, through famine and drought and other things. Billions of people are already affected. So it's not something that's happening in the future, but it's affecting the poor, you see. And this is where we have the great weakness, because we don't have enough information. All of these global models tell us what happens at the macro level. 3 degrees rise in temperature by 2100, or half a meter rise in sea level. Right? But what does it tell us about Bangladesh, or for that matter, the Gulf Coast of the United States? Those studies are beginning to emerge, and in the next round of Ipcc reports, you'll see that. But let me bring in another aspect which is very critical to this, and that has less to do with science, more to do with philosophy, and this is the whole issue of ethics and equity. Because right now, for example, and I missed the session yesterday, but one of the reasons for the failure of Copenhagen is basically if you have 190 odd countries playing a gaming strategy, you will never reach consensus. But if you take a principled approach, where in fact you have to appeal to people so that then they push their politicians to take a principled line, then ethics and equity have a role to play. What are the equity and issues? One is the poor of the world have the least to do with the problem, but they are going to suffer the most because of climate change. They are also the least capable of doing something to solve the problem. So I think this is a very serious issue. And then on the mitigation side, what I talked to you was about adaptation and vulnerability. So the answer to your question is we need a lot more to learn about vulnerability and adaptation. But we also need to look at mitigation, the side of reducing emissions, because if you look at the carbon budget, there is only a limited amount of carbon space left. And there simply is not enough carbon space left for the developing countries to grow so that they can grow out of poverty. So climate is not the problem that is necessarily going to kill billions of people. Poverty will, and they'll do it long before climate, not long before, but even now. So the issue is what the principled approach is. Those of us, and I include myself among you, who have enjoyed the benefits of high carbon emissions and have a high standard of living, what are we willing to give up in an ethical, principled way in order to give those people a chance? It's not just a question of putting $10 in a kitty and saying, okay, I'm supporting a child. That's not the problem. We need an approach where we need to change lifestyles, and I have a book written about it. We need to get the media and everybody working, because this is going to require a massive change towards sustainability, not only in terms of carbon budgets, but in terms of energy, water, minerals, and the whole spectrum. They are all interconnected. It has to be done now.
Just one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
If you want to find out more about that imbalance, we did a series in the New York Times in 2007 called The Climate Divide, which precisely articulates how the wealthy countries of the world that have built their wealth largely burning fossil fuels are using their wealth already to insulate themselves from climate risk. There are many examples of this, even as the poorest countries of the world, where all the population growth is as well, are sitting ducks.
And do you think it's a tougher time to try to make this equity case because of the dire straits that many, for instance, in the United States are feeling because of the economic downturn?
Absolutely.
We have to look beyond our families. We have to think about what we're doing with our activities in the rest of the world. It's a tough case right now.
Well, the reality, one of the toughest aspects of global warming is that it really does enshrine, finally, that kind of touchy-feely. They used to talk about in the 70s, think globally, act locally. But now, global is the new local. Global is a phrase that's out there on the internet, in the sense that we all are actually now starting slowly to integrate the reality that we live with a shared atmosphere, and that we're not sharing it. We're not sharing that carbon space, if you want to define it that way, equitably, and that consequences, poverty, people, a kid, one of the 1 billion teenagers who are alive in the world today, if they're in Somalia or Sudan, where they're facing climate extremes and other kinds of lack of opportunity, their fate is tied to ours by the other realities of our global world. So we're at this juncture now as a species where we're just, there have been 4 IPCC reports, another 5th one coming. There's this flow of information that shows just how connected the world is in uncomfortable ways as well as comfortable ones. And we have to integrate that into how we behave, as you just heard.
Just 30 seconds. Just to make this point, this is not about countries. It's more about income levels. In India and China, there are 50 to 100 million people who are living the same levels of affluence. I'm living in Sri Lanka. I have the same lifestyle as you. So there are poor people in America, and there are poor people in Europe. So it is more, it cuts across national boundaries. We have to remember that. And that's the whole point about an ethical and principled approach that is extremely important. The second important point is that basically we need not only to make our lifestyles more sustainable, but it can be done without excessive sacrifice. We have to make modest changes, but we don't have to give up the good life. We already know it. The IPCC and other reports show how we can follow a low carbon path, as well as a low energy path and so on. There is really no excuse to delay except the forces of status quo and that reluctance to change and that fear of what the change will bring. The second important point is that we can also set aside a small amount of insurance money to protect the poorest, like the Maldives and maybe parts of the southern United States which may go underwater, okay, like happened in Hurricane Katrina. This is called an adaptation safety net. So those are things, insurance policies that we can undertake now with relatively low cost, with a high certainty that it will contribute to a solution of the problem.
I should push back slightly against your frank optimism that if we had the political will, we could start to fix this in ways that wouldn't terribly alter our standards of living. You really believe that we have sort of a roadmap. If we just started following the roadmap, we could fix this.
I'll give you a different answer in terms of the research I'm doing now, which is why are we hooked on GDP, which measures material throughput? I'm working on measurements of green GDP, where we also incorporate things like environmental damage. And if you account for the environmental damage, your GDP growth drops to 0 or sometimes goes negative. Yeah. So basically, let me ask you a very quick question here, okay? How many of you feel that your life standard of living today is better than those of your grandparents? Raise your hands. Better. How many of you feel that the standard of living of your grandchildren will be better than yours? There you have it, okay? So that's partly the answer, that we are actually having the illusion of economic growth, which I showed in that bubble, but actually the quality of life is maybe has peaked and is beginning to go down. So that's the answer. How do we measure quality of life and satisfaction?
It's an interesting area, right, Andy, about how we measure these things?
We were just talking about this a little earlier. In 2005, I did a piece on Bhutan's experiment with gross national happiness. And other countries are developing indices of national well-being, where you measure things like access to health care and not just other aspects that reflect quality of life, as opposed to just growth of the economy and millions of jobs and that kind of thing. And it's there are people, as you were saying, within the American Commerce Department bureaucracy who are thinking about these kinds of things as well. But as I said, I think it's a slow transition. We're just, as I've written on .earth repeatedly, we're coming out of puberty as a species. We've been on this teen frat boy, cow tipping adventure for the last 200 years. Wow, look what I can do, Ma. And the scientists, the Ipcc, to me, reminds me, and on the blog I recently used a picture from Rebel Without a Cause. You remember the father with his apron chiding James Dean, you know, and Dean is like, and the idea is the scientists are like the warning adults. Come on, you've got to get serious, get focused. And the question remains and has been the same in the 20 years I've been writing about global warming. Scientists say, can an incremental increase in understanding of a looming problem change people's behavior? Make that teenager. There's a point as a teenager when you do say, oh shoot, that dent on the bumper, really, I've got to tell my parents about that. There's a point when you do take in a new level of responsibility, and we're kind of poised for that as a species. I tend to be an optimist overall on these things.
Another way of framing that, though, is that for most of human history, we've been engaged in a struggle to survive. Right? And we were legitimately afraid of what nature might do to us. At this point, most, at least the developed world, is thriving, probably beyond what's a reasonable bound in certain ways. And that's a very large change in perspective that is required at that point. Fear still plays a major role in driving our actions.
When you go out later for the break and you see the pile of apples and the cookies, it's like wanting the cookie, but you reach for the apple. You know that feeling. It's like, can we do that with fossil fuels? I don't know.
By the way, on the new economic indicators, I just finished a piece. Hopefully you'll see it soon. Did you know that the Gulf oil spill is net positive for GDP? It's a good thing that it happened, if that's your measure. Isn't that shocking? Just shocking. The decline in the fisheries is accounted for. The jobs that are created cleaning up are accounted for. But what you're actually doing to the fish and the shrimp is not accounted for. So it's just...
Yeah, absolutely right. Well said.
It's just fascinating. On this equity issue, it's been suggested that at a time where it's going to be a little tough for national governments to fork over cash to faraway places, he said, putting it bluntly, that maybe technology transfer is an important thing to think about, ways that which we can use our know-how to help other places in the world deal with the effects.
Can I show just 2 slides?
You're the man.
Well, I will just cut across a nod of, yeah. Okay, this is actually a very interesting slide about whether we've learned anything from the asset crisis. I tell you, we have not. And the question is, with climate change, we are on the edge of a precipice. Do we have the leisure to learn, or do we fall off the cliff and then find out? I mean, that's but let me go to the other, sorry, oops. I have a lot of slides here which I didn't intend. Okay, this is it. If you plot greenhouse gas emissions vertically and per capita income, GDP, horizontally, the rich countries are at point C, which is high income and high emissions. Poor countries are at point A, low emissions, low income. And rich countries are above the safe limit. Now, the first thing we have to do is the low carbon path. That's what's enshrined in the Kyoto Protocol and so on, to bring down emissions. But notice they don't go backwards on GDP. They can maintain a good life, but still, with known technologies today, bring their carbon emissions down. And you have the adaptation safety net for the poorest, right? But the second part is the answer to yours. That is, the developing countries who are aspiring to wealth cannot follow the same curve, the profligate curve, so to speak, of the last 2 centuries. There is not enough carbon space, there's not enough energy, there's not enough minerals and resources. So they have to find a lower path. It exists, it can be done, And that is where the technology cooperation and transfer is needed. If the Chinas and Indias and Brazils, they're making great efforts, by the way, to find the low carbon path and the low energy path. But they have to be helped. We have all the problems with copyrights and other things and patents and all of this. But the private sector is also a major part of this solution. This cannot be solved only by governments. In fact, governments have been singularly unsuccessful in dealing with some of these problems. So we need the private sector coming in to help with the technology transfer and being less selfish in terms of what they can give, and also civil society. That's you and I. Okay, we have to put the pressure, we have to put the squeeze on the decision makers to make the right decision before we go off the cliff.
Well,
Peter.
Coming back to the theme of what we know and what we don't know, the analogy has been used a number of times of, there's some precipice or we're on a mesa in a car and so on. I think that it's a real concern, and I'm quite concerned about that possibility as well. But I think we have to be very, very careful to say that we don't know if a precipice exists out there or not. I mean, it could be on this big plain and it's just going to be fine, kind of flatland. That would be a hopeful and probably naive interpretation. But at the same time, to say that there is a cliff out there that we're going to head over is, I think, too catastrophic. We don't know that. We are exposing ourselves to the risk of major changes. And what we have to do is think about rationally, how do we quantify that risk? And how do we understand how to ameliorate that risk as efficiently as possible relative to all the other things that we need to do in the world?
That always kills our pieces that we're writing when the scientist says something like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Which is, we can't prove that there's going to be a precipice, but we can't rule it out.
And it's possible to write stories that kind of reflect that, but they don't get onto page one.
Yeah,
That's the tough thing with this issue.
Well, that brings up, there's a reporting bias, right? I know if I write a paper that says the West Antarctic ice sheet is going to go unstable, it'll probably get in Nature, and that would be great. And I just was involved in writing a paper that said, we don't really know, and here's some other issues, and it'll be published somewhere else. That's fine. But what you hear about on the grand scale is tailored towards catastrophism. And we need to somehow regulate and regularize that type of information flow. Otherwise, in the end, I think the scientists are going to unduly look like alarmists, and that nations might not take the most rational course of action. I'm not trying, in a forum like this, I'm not trying to obviously say that we should not be acting and that we should not be taking this very seriously, but we should be very careful in how we discuss what the risks are.
In honor of Steve Schneider, who one of the great communicators of this very point, who just passed away a week ago, I'm going to pull a little experiment here that he used to do facing a similar crowd, and talking about this as a risk management enterprise, and which is what it fundamentally is. And anyone who tried to present this as an oversimplified rush to put out the fire kind of problem was not really being honest to the complexities that are not just in the sea level science, but in many other aspects of it. And so what he would do is he would look at an audience like this and say, how many of you own a home? And how many of you own a home? I do. Actually, I just paid off my mortgage. It's really cool.
All right.
How many of you have had a fire in your house, serious enough to call the fire department? It's always it's like 5% maybe. How many of you have fire insurance as part of your homeowner's policy? Duh. So that's the Steve Schneider Memorial exercise that should be done at every meeting discussing how we manage risk. And we do it really well at the level of the household, the person. We don't tend to run stop signs, that kind of thing. But we do it really poorly as the communities, and especially at the global level, we haven't figured this out yet. But we have the reflex, we have the norms. The house is not on fire, but there's funky wiring, and there's things that need to be done with this planetary house we have. And if we don't get busy as populations and consumption thirst crest in the next few decades, we'll face a lot of regrets that were probably somewhat avoidable.
Yeah, just a very quick reflection on that. Yes, I agree scientists have a very important responsibility not to present the results in an overblown fashion. But the cliff analogy is not in the context of climate change alone. This is the very first point I made. We've just been through a disastrous financial crisis where we just managed to avoid going off the cliff. And there were plenty of warnings about it which were ignored. We are going to face probably an energy crisis because as soon as demand growth picks up, we know that the demand for oil exceeds the supply and prices are going to go up. There is already emerging water and food crisis in many parts of the world. So all of these are converging, and climate is just an added burden that is going to exacerbate all these problems. It's also going to exacerbate the biodiversity and all the other issues. So the question is, there is no single cliff that we're going to fall off, but we are sort of on a slippery slope, which is getting more steep, right? So that is what we have to avoid. And it is trying to avoid falling victim to a kind of perfect storm where all of these things pile on, and human systems, governance systems, are incapable because international governance systems are not as strong as national ones, like you have, for example, in the United States. And a lot of these problems are globalized. So that is the context in which I talked about the cliff. Okay. But I do agree that as scientists, we do have a strong responsibility to talk in more measured terms, which our opponents do not have. They don't have that restriction.
You just mentioned that national governments may be better equipped to deal with this than the international structures. But it's interesting, isn't it, that a country like China seems to have better luck thinking about the future than, for instance, the American democracy? There's a paradox there.
Yes, I mean, the Chinese also have a long view of things. I mean, even if you look at their foreign policy or other things, you see much fewer flip-flops. One could link it to the rigidity of the political system or whatever it is, but I think there is something also about the ethos of having several millennia of stability and so on, which helps. Now, there are disadvantages because sometimes you need to make, to turn on a dime. And I think the US is a great example of that. That is why this is the home of all the major great innovations, because you can make fast changes as well. But the long-term view, I think, is going to be more and more important as we go into the future, because the Anthropocene, as we call it, has brought us into a period where the other analogy, I'm mixing metaphors here, it's like a supertanker. The decisions we make will take a long time to change, and it will require changes across the globe, not only locally. So that means we have to think more and more in terms of the long term and not in the short term and locally.
I'm interested to hear your questions of this incredible panel. We have some microphones here, and we're going to ask that you'll be the first one. Here comes a microphone. Tell us your name and if you're representing somebody who.
Yeah, my name's Morgan Williams. I'm from Flux Farm Foundation down in Carbondale. You alluded to this a little bit. I'm curious if you could comment at all on the role of democracy in climate science and action when you're talking about whether it's 190 countries trying to develop policy on the global scale, or 300 million in the United States, or 6.9 billion globally. If you have hope that democracy can adequately address the energy and climate issues that we face, or do you feel like maybe we've outgrown democracy in addressing some of these issues at the scale that we have them? If we are in fact falling off of a cliff, we might just be naive to think that the majority is always right.
Can I mention one quick thing?
No.
The last chapter of Steve Schneider's last book, the title of the chapter is "Can Democracy Survive Complexity?" And you could actually flip it around. Can complexity survive democracy? Maybe a more apt title these days, given what happened with the energy bill. We have the polarization of our current form of democracy in the United States is a very tough situation. And even McCain in 2005, when I interviewed him about Arctic issues, he said, democracy, our form of government is really bad at this kind of problem. And of course, he's disappeared from the climate landscape since then. So
well, look at the state of California, where there is a whole lot of democracy because of the structure of that state. They have ballot propositions in which you have direct democracy. And what's on the ballot in the fall, right? A possibility of rolling back California's cap and trade. I mean, when you ask individual voters, don't we tend to go for the cookie, not the apple?
yeah.
But democracies have proven quite resilient. China is doing very well in the moment, but whether or not such an authoritarian type of regime will be stable in the long run, I don't think it's clear. I think we should not be so quick to dismiss the values of our current system, and also in addressing long-term issues, even if it takes a while to come to some sort of agreement.
Or about the power of maybe grassroots movements within a democracy for pulling out change.
I would stress that. I think pluralism is also an important word with democracy. Because if democracy means the tyranny, so to speak, of the majority over everybody else, then you get into this where you make wrong decisions and you're locked in. But as you said, I mean, the United States is a good example where the federal government has not made the right decision, from my perspective anyway. There are lots of other initiatives at the state level, at the municipal level, and that's good. Because when those decisions are seen as good ones over a period of time, then other people will say, hey, if they can do it, we can do it too. So there are, as I said, many paths to sustainability.
Question here. Tell us your name.
Mark Gold from an environmental group in California called Heal the Bay. Just as a follow-up on this, I think one of the things when you're talking about democracy is sort of the maybe the high school version of democracy and what we were taught as opposed to what actually exists. So using the California example, Proposition 23 is bought and paid for by Texas petroleum companies, right? So what's happened with the recent Supreme Court ruling last year, the corporatization of democracy and the impacts there, what are your feelings on how we start getting through that issue to really start making a dent here? And honestly, that's the driver of what's going on in California right now, is that those corporations are using the proposition process to put it before the public during the economic downturn.
Yeah, it's a money and politics question, Andy.
Well, there, the transparency and the media, and not just, and when I say the media, I don't mean the traditional newspapers, but I mean social media. Anyone who can file a FOIA, Freedom of Information request, or try to sustain the kind of inquiry that's necessary to reveal, as Center for Public Integrity, I think, did this a year or two ago, the blossoming of energy lobbyists in Washington around the climate bill, and on both sides. And now there's I can't remember what the number was. It's 100-fold more lobbyists on this issue than there are legislators in Washington, and revealing that and making sure the public understands that what are the forces behind what we consider options in the legislative arena on climate. Why was cap and trade the persistent concept for so long, and now what can come next? Those forces that are shaping those things often aren't necessarily shaped by pure scientific logic. I'll just give you one quick example, and we did this story in 2006 about energy research. There's a bias when the government has a finite chunk of energy money to send it toward the places that have the most political oomph, like clean coal. Carbon sequestration has eaten up a much bigger chunk of basic energy research than people doing photovoltaic, solar panel work would see as scientifically valid. So, but just saying that, getting it out there, I think is a vital part of our democratic system, is to reveal what are the forces that make the conversation the way it is.
Right there. Tell us your name. Yeah. Actually, I'll get back to you, sir. It's a woman with a floral pattern thing.
Thanks. I'm Jo Chataway from RAND Europe. We're a not-for-profit think tank. I think my question follows on from the first question. I'm interested in, you mentioned South Korea's very creative use of its financial stimulus package. And instead of asking why we couldn't do what South Korea did, I'm interested in knowing how they managed it. What allowed them to do that?
I don't have the answer to that question, but basically, probably their banks were not in such a parlous state as either the European or the US banks. And secondly, I think the government is in a stronger position. I think they won't get so much kickback from people and lobbyists. I'm not sure. But the third point really is that Korea, like China, has consistently taken a long view. One of the reasons Korea has succeeded over the last 30, 40 years, for example, with their export-oriented growth program, is because whichever the government, they stuck with that plan, with that game plan. So here they see, and I'm giving some advice to their Prime Minister's office, the President's office, they see the green economy, this is another catchword, as the way of the future. And they're putting a lot of resources. There are think tanks with PhDs, well-funded, who are working on this. So I think that's part of it. They see an opening. They see that the wave of the future is probably in the direction of sustainability. So why not put our money in there?
Just really quickly, I interviewed the president of South Korea last year, and I was over there writing about the greening of Seoul, the city. He's committed, as you say. They also, one of the other things they're doing that we're not doing, they have a much higher percentage of their GDP going into basic research and development. Their science and technology push is extraordinary right now, and a big chunk of that is on energy. And you know, if I had looked around the global landscape for where the big next breakthroughs could come from, you can't look at the United States alone anymore. That used to be kind of the norm, but there's rising centers of excellence in Asia that are going to be very important to watch.
The gentleman who stood up first, though, you get a shot at this. Here comes the mic.
I'm Nelson Guda. I'm a biologist and a photographer. I have a question about communication. So stepping a little bit back from where you were talking about, Andy, there's actually been a longer cycle of scientific communication. I think that the community went from being typically scientific in expressing a lot of uncertainties about climate change, and then they ramped up to try and express a little bit more certainty in response to all the attacks they were getting from the skeptics. If you look at 10 years, I think this is kind of what happened. And then there was a lot of certainty expressed both from the scientific community and from supporters, you know, like Al Gore's film. And then that created this sort of backlash, and now a lot of scientists are pulling back again to their typical position of how they normally communicate uncertainty. And so I think that there's a challenge here in trying to communicate with skeptics, because they present data and information that's often misinformation, or data that doesn't have to be underneath the type of scrutiny that scientific data gets. So they don't get the same type of backlash from the information that they present. How do you deal with that?
The scientific, there's been some interesting experiments. Realclimate.org, the blog, I think has been a great experiment in trying to both counter unsupported portrayals of climate science by skeptics and sometimes by overstaters. They've kind of tried to say this is what the science really says. I think more experiments like that are important. I don't think it's perfect. As the emails, the ClimateGate guys, you know, were very quick to jump on some things involving some of the people at Real Climate early on, where it was mainly focused on supporting the hockey stick. We won't get into that right now. The bottom line is the science community, especially in a world of shrinking conventional journalism focused on specialized things like science and the environment, has to get more engaged in explaining the process of science, in getting out there. Institutions, universities, the national academies, the AAAS have to be much more engaged, and they're getting more engaged, NSF, in direct communication of science via Facebook, via other means like that. I just before I came up on the podium here, I posted on my blog Columbia University's press office did what I consider the perfect press release. I would never normally reproduce one as just sort of journalism, but it's about clarifying what caused the heavy snows last winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And read it to find out the answer. And it's, they're doing the kind of work that needs to be done more, that direct output. As one climate scientist, Wetlaufer at Yale, told me, they also have to maintain what he said was a caustic honesty about the nature of what we know and don't know. And also what's unknowable. This gets into some of these issues. There are certain aspects of the climate problem that will not be resolved on the time scale the public is demanding information. Regional climate forecasting, not possible. You could give NASA 10 times a bigger supercomputer, and Gavin Schmidt, who also runs Real Climate, that blog at NASA, will say that's not going to give you a better picture of conditions in Chicago in 2020. So that's another aspect.
By the way, you remember during the snow in D.C. when Senator Charles Imhoff, what did they build, an igloo out in front of the Capitol?
In fact, I just alluded to that in my piece.
And so it was 103 in D.C. the other day, and I didn't see him come out and say I was wrong.
Well, but there you get into, there's a habit. Activists or advocates within the political realm, or just at environmental groups or anti-environmental groups, whatever group you choose, there's this thing called, opportunism, the thing of the moment that fits your argument. You go. And that happened with Katrina in a big way, even though the science on hurricanes in a warming world remains highly complicated. Fewer hurricanes in a warming world, but more in the higher categories. Now, how do you say that message in a 2-minute spot on the radio or TV?
Peter,
There's also an opportunism with portraying the uncertainty. Often uncertainty is billed as a reason not to do something, which frankly is insane, because what we're saying is this is our best estimate, but it actually could be better or worse. And in many ways, the best estimate, I think, is going to be difficult enough. Great if it's not as bad as that. That would be wonderful. But if it's worse, then we have some serious things to worry about. In many ways, the costs don't scale linearly with the climate change, right? At some level, you really do start to fall off a cliff if you start to get very, very hot temperatures. And those are the ones we really need to be worried about. So we need to start, I think, billing in many ways uncertainty as a cause for action. Because we don't know what's going to happen, we better guard ourselves against it.
And again, this was anathema to the environmental activist community. Anyone who talked about uncertainty, including me, was punished brutally for daring to say there are things about climate change we still don't know. Even if you're saying that that's the reason for action, it's not a message that is seen as sellable in Washington or on the front page of a newspaper, which is where you need to get that message if you're an activist.
But see, there's a big disconnect. When we're talking about climate change, there's a threat multiplier. There was a discussion about that yesterday. North Korea, we don't know what it's going to do. So should we ignore it in terms of a national threat? Greenland, we don't know what it's going to do. Should we ignore it? I mean, we have to approach these things with, I think, a certain degree of rationality and hard-nosed kind of, this is a realistic response in both cases.
Dr. Munasinghe?
Yeah, I wanted to just reflect on the broader implications of what you said, because the scientific enterprise is actually very well managed. We have a very strict peer review process, and there are very few cheaters. They are caught and they are badly punished. But when moment you get into science policy, into the domain of the lobbies and others, there is the asymmetry that you mentioned. Yeah. It's very unfair, but that doesn't mean that the legitimate scientists or the responsible scientists should reduce our standards and go in for sensationalism. No, because if we do that, we become them, and then you lose the game. And the broader implications of this are also very clear, that we have to have principles and we have to teach the young people as they grow up that these are also important. For example, the financial crisis is a classic example. Greed is good was the theme, and eventually, as long as there were only a few people cheating and doing that, it was all right. But eventually everybody tried to get on the bandwagon and the whole system collapsed. So this is the same type of thing that we have to teach people at a very young age, and so that the principled approach that we are in a globalized world, we are facing major problems. We have to think of the long term, and we have to think in terms of ethical principles and the right way of doing it, because taking the shortcuts eventually will lead to disaster. I mean, it's a very broad theme, but it's a very important lesson, and I think the financial crisis drove that point home very, very clearly.
One tiny quick snippet people could read. The journal Nature, in its news pages a year or so ago, I alluded to this on .earth recently, had a piece, Do We Need to Go to Risk School? And actually, it was a big, long analysis of whether having this kind of risk, study of risk, even in early education, be something that we do as a new norm.
There's a very accessible book by Barry Glassner about, I forgot what the title is, but it's about how we worry about the wrong things because we don't assess risk correctly. I commend it. Sir.
Hi, Chet Tzeski with the Global Green Grants Fund here in Boulder, an environmental foundation that supports environmental groups in developing countries. I think we've finally scratched the surface here of something new and important, and that is to focus less on risk and more on opportunity. What we know in climate science is a great deal more than we know about social science, and in particular, how the prime movers of social change operate. The few people in the world who actually are social movement scholars get very little attention at conferences like this, when in fact what we're talking about here is sort of amateur speculation about what they know for sure. And what they know for sure is that social movements are one of those things that cause social change in ways that we can't overestimate. And that the dependent variable in social movement success seems to be unexpected political opportunity. And that's what we're speculating about here. So the question then becomes, how do we anticipate unexpected opportunity better? And we've had many examples here, including the Korea example. I think that the strength of social movements in Korea, both the labor movement, the environmental movement, and the human rights movement, might account for the political will that's generated to do things that we don't see elsewhere in the world. So my question to you is, why don't we talk more to social scientists who are studying unexpected social change, because that's what we're all hoping for here.
I know, and it's funny, when you talk to climate scientists, I don't know if you're going to share this, Peter, but what's your view on the social scientists? It's not always as rigorous.
Yeah, obviously it's indispensable, but we want to make sure the social movement is moving in as sound a direction as possible. And I think it's sensible to try to connect through, from beginning to end, what our understanding is of the science all the way through to how we should best take action on a broad level. And so, yeah, I think the conversation needs to be across all these disciplinary boundaries. Yeah. That's quite a good point.
And in the Ipcc, the history of the Ipcc was very much grounded in the physical sciences, and it's only in the recent iterations that there's been very slow push to integrate more. There isn't even a section in the Ipcc report, all these volumes on on the psychology of risk and how we perceive different kinds of risks and how that relates to how you make decisions. The working group 3, which is about the policy side of climate, what do you do, doesn't really have nearly an adequate examination of what we've learned, and there's a lot out there. Not all of it's empirical, and you're right about whoever was saying that there's a different set of, how do you have a norm, a paradigm in some of the social sciences is tougher. But it's clear that it's been underplayed, under-examined.
Yeah, very quickly, I couldn't agree with you more. And in my graduate courses, I stress very much the role of social change and social capital, so to speak, which is the analog of economic capital and natural capital, which is the social capital is the one that is totally ignored. And the Ipcc, for example, I've been with the Ipcc more than 20 years, all for assessment reports, and it's been painfully difficult to switch the emphasis a little bit because climate scientists are very resistant to these changes. But it is extremely important. And to finish on a partially anecdotal note, I mean, it's not only scientists who are bamboozled, even seasoned politicians are. Last year, I gave a seminar at the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a huge celebration in Germany. All the world's leaders came, and Gorbachev organized that particular session for Nobel people. And when I gave the talk, I talked about the young people, the role of young people. And the political leaders who were there were very enthused. After the meeting, Angela Merkel was there and Gorbachev and others, and he gave me this example. He said, you know what brought down the Berlin Wall? It was just young people taking advantage of an opportunity. He said because November 10th, 1989 was when the wall came down. In May, Gorbachev had visited Helmut Kohl in Germany, and they had discussed the two Germanys, and they decided, they said, well, it's a good thing if they merge, but it won't happen till the next century. I mean, until the year 2000 and beyond. The two most canny politicians in Europe agreed on that. And he said within 6 months, there was a small technical error in a communique issued by the East German government, which said the checkpoint will be opened for a certain period for people to cross. And immediately 50 or 100,000 young people came to the checkpoint. And they just walked across, and the border guards were afraid to shoot. And that's what happened. It was not politically calculated, just people taking social capital at work. So that's a classic example, and the fact that somebody like Gorbachev and Helmut Kohl couldn't predict it certainly means that there are opportunities, and we have to spend more time finding what makes these social changes possible.
I'd love to see your notes of this session. I wrote down social capital. I wrote down uncertainty as a case for action. In my years as a broadcaster, success has to do with not libeling anybody during the course of the broadcast, not saying any swear words, and getting off on time. So I have 10:02 and 20 seconds. Thank you very much to this wonderful panel.